US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Imagine this: the powerful Ford Bronco pickup truck, a symbol of the American road, suddenly becomes $6,000 more expensive. Not because of a new design, not because of an improved engine, but because of Canadian steel, or more precisely, the lack thereof. Something has gone wrong. America has imposed tariffs to protect its metal, but now warehouses are emptying, factories in Detroit are cutting shifts, and workers are wondering who is really being hit by this tax.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Canada, long known as the quiet neighbor, has decided not to make a fuss. No loud statements, no retaliatory tariffs, no trade threats. It has simply cut off supplies. One by one, projects that previously depended on supplies from the US switched to domestic needs. Power plants, farms, hydrogen plants all began to be built with Canadian steel. Factories that had recently been preparing layoff lists restarted production. And all this under the guise of a green transformation.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
While Washington imposed tariffs, Ottawa built electric furnaces. While the Americans tried to hold onto the market by force, the Canadians restructured their metallurgical industry to meet new standards. Carbon emissions? Down 90%. Electricity? From hydroelectric sources. And most importantly, Canadian steel now flows freely to Europe, Japan and South Korea, bypassing their strict carbon barriers. American steel does not.
But I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Meanwhile, in the US, we see the other side of the story. Metal prices have risen due to tariffs. Construction is slowing down. Machines are becoming more expensive. Workers are losing hours. Budgets are bursting at the seams. The economy that they tried to protect has begun to sink under the weight of its own decisions. And all this without a single shot being fired. Just the quiet moves of a neighbor who always seemed to play by someone else's rules.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
But perhaps this is not the end. Perhaps the balance of power is shifting right now. Perhaps Canada is no longer just a supplier of raw materials, but a new leader in the clean technology market. And while the US argues about who is to blame, its northern partner is simply moving forward.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
This video is not just about steel. It's about politics, strategy, and how sometimes silence speaks louder than any statement. It's about how an economic war can start with a newspaper headline and end with a lost dinner for a working family in Ohio. And it's about how, in the global game, it's not the loudest who survive, but those who know how to change in time. So who really benefited from the 50% tariff? Let's find out.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
When the U.S. administration led by Donald Trump announced the introduction of a 50% tariff on steel imports in 2022, it was presented as a show of strength. The White House said it was time to put America first, close loopholes in the country's steel shield, and regain control over key industries. But at that moment, no one knew that a single signature on the decree would set off an economic domino effect that would hurt not only U.S. factories but also consumers themselves, from big car companies to family farms in the Midwest. And perhaps the country that made the least noise was the one that historically supplied up to 17% of all steel to the U.S. Canada.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
The Canadian response did not look like an act of retaliation. There were no urgent statements from the Prime Minister, no rallies with no tariff slogans, not even statements about a trade crisis. It seemed like silence, but beneath this silence lay a carefully calculated and almost imperceptible turnaround. First, there was a gradual reduction in shipments of technically complex items, rolled steel, high-strength sheets, and pipe steel. Then came cuts in contracts with car manufacturers in Michigan and Ohio. And then export lines at the border were suspended altogether. None of these steps looked like aggression. Everything was presented as internal reorientation. American officials did not even pay much attention to this at first. After all, Canada had not formally violated any agreements. Trade shipments continued, but not at all in the same volumes. Just 6 months after the tariff was introduced, Detroit's auto plants began to report shortages of alloy steel. Production chains, especially in the machine building and military industries, began to experience disruptions. One engineer at a company that manufactures parts for armored vehicles anonymously admitted in a report to Congress that they had to suspend shipments due to unstable supplies of 36 double alloy, which had previously been sourced from Ontario.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
But these were just the first cracks. By early 2023, the entire range of steel products in the U.S. had risen in price, from beams and rebar to galvanized coils. Some items rose in price by 42%. This did not just hit builders and the auto industry, it triggered a chain reaction. According to the National Association of Home Builders, the cost of building a high school in Texas rose by $1.3 million due to changes in metal prices alone. And in Illinois, the reconstruction of a bridge over the Des Plaines River had to be halted because the company that won the tender promised to use Canadian steel but was unable to obtain it on time due to temporary shipping restrictions.
with Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
Against this backdrop, the situation in Canada was completely different. No one there was talking about a tariff war. Instead, the government announced a massive industrial transformation program, $1.2 billion to modernize steel mills in Hamilton, Sydney, and St. John's. Blast furnaces were replaced with electric arc furnaces. Old production lines were replaced with robotic sections. Layoffs were replaced with retraining. In Hamilton alone, more than 2,500 new jobs were created through the launch of a green steel production line with reduced carbon emissions. Officially, it was called the Clean Steel Transition, but unofficially, it was a move away from dependence on the US. Previously, up to 70% of Canadian steel was exported to America. This made Canada vulnerable to any changes in its southern neighbors' policy. But now the priority has shifted. The government introduced an internal directive: all state infrastructure projects from wind farms in British Columbia to gas pipelines in Alberta must use only domestically produced steel. This allowed demand to be redirected and dependence on US imports to be reduced. Even private companies receiving government loans have committed to purchasing only certified Canadian steel. The market reacted immediately. Domestic prices stabilized. Canadian products, with their low carbon footprint, became in demand in Europe and Asia, especially after the EU introduced the so-called GAMA, a carbon tax on import. While American steel began to lose out to competitors in international tenders due to non-compliance with environmental standards, Canadian manufacturers received direct orders worth millions of dollars from Germany and Japan. Canadian trade unions, previously dissatisfied with the instability in the industry, began to publicly support the new course. The Toronto Steelworkers Federation even issued a rare statement calling the government's actions a quiet revolution in industrial policy. Confidence in the industry began to grow. Working families who had recently been living on welfare returned to stable wages. The province of New Brunswick saw a 4.6% increase in employment, a record high in the last 15 years. At the same time, less noticeable but no less important changes began to take place. Canada signed agreements with South Korea and France, recognizing its steel as clean under environmental standards. This automatically exempted it from additional import taxes in these countries. This means that at a time when global markets are taking a tougher stance on carbon footprints, Canadian steel has a competitive advantage, not because of its volume, but because of its quality and compliance with modern requirements. And all this happened without slogans, threats, or trade wars. The US tried to put pressure on Canada, but ended up forcing it to stand on its own 2 feet. A policy designed to restore the greatness of American industry has ended up strengthening Canada. And while Washington argues about who is to blame for rising prices and reduced working hours, Ottawa simply continues to work. The machines are humming. The smelters are working 3 shifts, and Canadian steel is becoming a symbol not only of economic resilience but also of political foresight. While Canada was strengthening its domestic production by modernizing factories and creating thousands of new jobs, a completely different story was unfolding in the United States. American car manufacturers, logistics companies, and construction contractors began to feel the heavy consequences of the tariff policy, which had been adopted with confident statements about protecting national interests. But behind these political slogans lay an increasingly difficult economic reality. The tariffs that were supposed to save the domestic steel industry began to literally strangle those who depended on it. In Detroit, once a symbol of American industrial power, Ford and General Motors factories began massive recalculations. Due to the surge in metal prices, the cost of producing each pickup truck increased by $5,000 to $6,000. Reports from independent think tanks sent to the Senate stated bluntly that the tariff policy was a time bomb. One internal report to the vice president of GM contained phrase, "If the cost of steel rises by another 12%, We will not just lose profits, we will lose consumers. As a result, production of one of the new electric pickup models at a plant in Michigan was frozen, and some employees were transferred to reduced working hours, with their salaries cut by 22%. In official company statements, this measure was called a temporary adjustment, but behind the scenes they said it was all the fault of steel. At the same time, in states dependent on machine building and heavy industry, contractors serving large manufacturers began to close. In Ohio, Mid-River Fastenings, a manufacturer of bolt fasteners for masts and bridges, filed for bankruptcy after its contract with the U.S. Department of Transportation was cancelled due to budget overruns. The reason was the rising cost of metal. The company had been in business since 1963. A sign on its premises read, "Made in America means something here," but patriotism proved powerless in the face of the economy. Consumers also suffered. Whereas a pickup truck used to cost an average of $38,000, the same model now costs more than $44,000. For Americans, especially those who live in the country's industrial belt and use cars not for image but for real work, this difference has become critical. Many have postponed purchases or decided not to upgrade their vehicles at all. Car dealerships began to see a 17% drop in demand for certain models. This led to excess inventory in warehouses and new losses. This hit dealers in Pennsylvania and Indiana particularly hard, where the customer base consisted of workers and farmers rather than high-income office workers. And while the market was in turmoil, massive layoffs began at second-tier companies, parts manufacturers, logistics operators, and equipment suppliers. In Chicago, at a factory that manufactured brake mechanisms for buses and trucks, a third of the shifts were cancelled. Employees were offered the option of voluntarily switching to a 3-day work week. One worker named Joe Martin, who had worked there for 14 years, told a regional television station, "Canada didn't let us down. Our own people let us down." Worse still, the tariff hit not only the domestic market but also export competitiveness. American products became so expensive that they lost ground even in markets where they had previously been strong. A contract to supply construction farms for a stadium in Chile, which a Texas company was set to win, ultimately went to a manufacturer in Quebec. The reason was price, $3,700 per ton cheaper, with comparable quality. For many within the industry, this was an alarming sign. While the US was playing tariff defense, other countries were moving ahead on the global stage. Canada, meanwhile, continued to strengthen its domestic industry. At a parliamentary meeting, the Minister of Economic Development stated that the priority is jobs for Canadians and a sustainable industry, not exports at any cost. This statement received widespread support among workers. In Halifax, a Fair Metal, Fair Work March was held, featuring not politicians but ordinary people, electricians, assemblers, steel workers. They did not talk about tariffs, but about stability. While workers in the US were losing hours and bonuses, in Canada they were being paid to train for new jobs in green technology-related metallurgy. Some US congressmen tried to accuse Canada of hidden protectionism, pointing out that federal contracts were now only being awarded to companies using locally produced steel. But in essence, this was a mirror measure exactly the same as the one the US had introduced a few years earlier. The only difference was in the presentation. Canada did not shout about bringing back great industry. It simply did it quietly, purposefully, without unnecessary noise. In response to the accusations, the Minister of Trade merely remarked, "We are not building walls. We have simply stopped lending out our ladders." It was precisely this strategic calm that proved most dangerous for the US. Instead of a trade war, they got a fissure. Instead of noise, they got a weakening of their position. And instead of triumph, they got growing discontent at home. Internal reports from the US Department of Labor for the end of 2023 showed that employment in the steel industry grew by only 1.1%, while in Canada it grew by 8.4%. Moreover, a report by the National Bureau of Economic Research came to an unexpected conclusion. Steel tariffs had a temporary positive effect on domestic plants, but in the long run caused price increases, a decline in competitiveness, and a chain reaction in related industries. All this happened while Canadian factories were working 3 shifts, re-equipping to meet EU requirements, and sending the first batch of clean steel to the construction of a new high-speed railway line in Japan. American policy backfired, and Canada, instead of arguing, was simply ready. while American politicians continued to insist on the need for tariffs, repeating the mantra of protectionism for national security. What many economists were already calling a metallurgical renaissance was taking place in Canada. But behind the fancy terms lay very real processes, from technological modernization to a fundamental shift in the country's positioning on the world stage. Canada used to be a supplier modest, reliable, technically strong, but still dependent on American imports. Today, it is increasingly becoming a rule-setting player, not just a steel producer, but a bearer of new standards, environmental, technological, and social. One of the turning points was the adaptation to the so-called Gamma carbon border adjustment mechanism introduced by the European Union. While most countries, including the US, were unprepared for the sharp tightening of carbon dioxide emission requirements, Canada has already reported its first deliveries of green steel produced with a minimal carbon footprint using electric arc furnaces and hydropower. This automatically exempted its products from new European duties, while American manufacturers had to pay for every ton. Moreover, Japanese and French contracts now directly incorporated environmental criteria into their purchasing conditions, and Canadian steel was a perfect fit. This became particularly evident when the Canadian company Greencore Steel signed an exclusive contract with a major German construction company to supply 18,000 tons of steel for bridges across the Rhine, a contract that was originally intended for an American manufacturer in Ohio.